Sony appears to be making one of the biggest strategic shifts the company has made in years, and honestly, it feels like PlayStation is finally remembering what made the brand so dominant in the first place. After spending the last several years aggressively pushing towards live service projects, multiplayer initiatives, PC expansion, and subscription ecosystem growth, Sony is now signaling that narrative-driven single-player console exclusives are once again becoming the centerpiece of the PlayStation identity. At the exact same time, though, Sony is also raising the price of PlayStation Plus subscriptions in multiple regions, creating a situation where many players are looking at the company and asking two very different questions simultaneously. On one hand, there's excitement because PlayStation fans have been wanting Sony to refocus on what it historically did better than almost anyone else in the gaming industry. On the other hand, there's frustration because gaming overall keeps becoming more expensive and players are increasingly feeling like they're being asked to spend more money for ecosystems that don't always feel consumer friendly. And when you combine those two stories together, you start to see the bigger picture surrounding where PlayStation is heading and where the gaming industry itself may be heading over the next several years. For a long time, Sony built the PlayStation brand around prestige single-player experiences that felt like major entertainment events. When people thought about buying a PlayStation console, they often thought about games like God of War Ragnarok, The Last of Us Part 2, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Forbidden West, Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, and Bloodborne. These weren't just games people casually played for a weekend before moving on. These were system sellers. These were the experiences people associated with the PlayStation brand itself. Sony spent years building an image where PlayStation represented cinematic storytelling, polished production values, emotional narratives, and large-scale adventures that felt distinctly premium compared to what many competitors were offering at the time. Whether someone personally preferred those types of games or not, it was impossible to deny that Sony had found a formula that consistently worked both critically and commercially. Then the industry started changing. Live service games began generating unbelievable amounts of revenue. Publishers saw titles capable of earning money continuously for years instead of relying on one-time purchases. Battle passes, seasonal updates, cosmetic monetization, recurring engagement systems, and long-term player retention suddenly became the obsession of nearly every major publisher in gaming. Companies didn't just want successful games anymore. They wanted platforms. They wanted ecosystems. They wanted players constantly engaged, constantly spending, and constantly returning. Sony clearly saw that shift happening and decided it needed to become a much bigger part of that space. Over the last several years, Sony invested heavily into live service ambitions, acquired studios with multiplayer expertise, and repeatedly talked about long-term engagement strategies. The company openly discussed plans for numerous live service projects, and for a while, it felt like PlayStation was attempting to reposition itself into something broader than simply the place for single-player exclusives. The problem is that many PlayStation fans never really seemed fully convinced this was the right direction. There's a reason people bought into the PlayStation ecosystem in the first place, and it wasn't because Sony was known for dominating multiplayer live service markets. Sony already had a clear identity that separated PlayStation from competitors, and many players felt nervous watching the company drift away from the identity-chasing trends that had already become overcrowded and highly volatile. The live service market is brutally competitive. For every breakout success story, there are countless failures that disappear almost immediately after launch. Players only have so much time, so much money, and so much attention they can dedicate to ongoing games. Even established live service titles constantly struggle to maintain engagement long term. And unlike traditional single-player games, where success can often be measured through sales and critical reception, live service projects require sustained player populations, constant updates, ongoing monetization pipelines, server infrastructure, and years of support. The cost and risk are enormous. Over time, cracks in Sony's strategy started becoming more visible. Reports emerged about canceled projects, internal concerns, shifting priorities, and uncertainties surrounding some of these multiplayer ambitions. Some live service projects reportedly struggled during development, while others quietly disappeared altogether. Sony also started facing criticism from players who felt the company was slowly losing sight of what originally made PlayStation special. Instead of excitement surrounding future first party projects, conversations increasingly centered around uncertainty. People wondered whether Sony would continue prioritizing cinematic storytelling experiences or whether those games would eventually become secondary to multiplayer monetization initiatives. That uncertainty mattered because PlayStation's identity has always been one of its biggest strengths. Now, though, Sony's messaging appears to be changing significantly. The company once again seems to be emphasizing narrative driven exclusives as a core pillar of the brand. And honestly, this feels less like Sony discovering something new, and more like Sony realizing it already had one of the strongest identities in gaming before it started chasing broader industry trends. Single player exclusives weren't a weakness Sony needed to move beyond. They were the reason PlayStation became such a dominant brand in the first place. Those games created prestige, anticipation, and loyalty. They gave players a reason to choose PlayStation hardware specifically because those experiences couldn't be found elsewhere at launch. In many ways, Sony's exclusives became cultural events. Players looked forward to them years in advance. Entire console generations were partially defined by them. One of the most important things Sony may have realized is that prestige matters more now than ever. The gaming industry has become saturated with live service games competing for attention, many of which feel interchangeable to consumers. A polished single player exclusive still has the ability to stand out in a massive way because fewer companies consistently deliver them at the highest level anymore. When Sony releases a major first party narrative game, it still commands attention across the entire industry. People discuss the visuals, storytelling, gameplay mechanics, performances, music, and technical achievements for months. Those releases create excitement in ways that many live service launches simply don't anymore, because the market has become flooded with games attempting to retain players forever. At the same time, though, Sony is increasing PlayStation Plus subscription prices, and this is where the conversation becomes much more complicated. Because while players may be excited hearing Sony recommit to narrative driven exclusives, they're also dealing with the reality that gaming overall is becoming significantly more expensive. Subscription prices continue rising across entertainment industries. Game prices increased to $70 this generation. Console prices have risen in multiple regions. Accessories are more expensive. Collector's editions continue becoming more aggressive. Deluxe editions increasingly lock content behind higher price tiers. And digital ecosystems continue expanding in ways that make some consumers uncomfortable regarding ownership and preservation. PlayStation Plus itself has become a particularly divisive topic because many players already question whether the higher subscription tiers consistently justified their costs before these increases. Some months offer genuinely strong additions, while other months leave subscribers feeling underwhelmed. The extra and premium tiers especially have faced criticism from players who feel the value proposition fluctuates too dramatically. Unlike subscription ecosystems that heavily emphasize day one first party launches, Sony's approach has often felt more conservative, which makes price increases more difficult for certain consumers to accept. When subscription costs rise, so do expectations. Players naturally begin asking harder questions about value, consistency, and long term benefits. This broader frustration isn't directed solely at Sony either. The entire gaming industry is facing grower consumer fatigue surrounding monetization. Players are increasingly aware of how expensive modern gaming has become, especially during a time when many people are already struggling financially in everyday life. Companies continue talking about growth, engagement, and profitability while simultaneously asking consumers to accept higher costs across nearly every aspect of gaming. Eventually, there's a point where people begin reevaluating what subscriptions they actually need, what ecosystems they want to invest in, and whether companies are truly delivering enough value to justify continual increases. Sony returning to a stronger single player focus could help offset some of that frustration because those experiences are exactly what many players associate with PlayStation value. People are often more willing to invest in an ecosystem when they feel genuinely excited about exclusive content they can't experience elsewhere. That's one reason why these narrative driven exclusives matter so much strategically. They don't just sell copies individually, they reinforce the identity of the platform itself. They create reasons for consumers to stay invested in PlayStation hardware and services long term. Sony's exclusives historically gave players confidence that PlayStation offered experiences unavailable anywhere else, and that factor became a major competitive advantage. There's also another important factor here that I think a lot of publishers are slowly realizing. Players are getting exhausted by constant live service demands. Many gamers no longer want every title to become an endless commitment requiring daily logins, seasonal progression systems, battle passes, rotating stores, and fear of missing out mechanics. There's a growing appreciation again for complete experiences players can simply purchase, enjoy, finish, and remember. That doesn't mean live service games are disappearing because they absolutely are not. But it does mean companies may be rediscovering the value of focused experiences that respect players' time differently. Sony already excelled at delivering those types of games for years. Returning to that strength makes a tremendous amount of sense. What's interesting is that this shift could also influence the broader industry. When one of the largest gaming companies in the world starts emphasizing premium narrative experiences again after aggressively pursuing live service expansion, other publishers may begin reevaluating their own strategies too. The industry often follows trends collectively, sometimes to unhealthy extremes. There was a period where nearly every publisher chased battle royale success. Then nearly everyone chased live service engagement. But not every company needs to pursue identical strategies to succeed. In fact, differentiation is often one of the most valuable things a brand can have. Sony's identity became powerful precisely because PlayStation exclusives felt distinct from what other companies were doing. There's also the question of trust. Sony spent years building enormous goodwill with players through its first party output, but goodwill can disappear faster than companies sometimes realize. Raising prices while simultaneously pushing monetization harder across the industry creates tension with consumers. Players are becoming more skeptical, more cautious, and more vocal about feeling nickel and dimed. If Sony wants players to accept increasing subscription costs, the company needs to consistently reinforce why PlayStation remains worth investing in. High quality narrative exclusives are one of the strongest ways Sony can do that because they represent something tangible consumers immediately recognize as valuable. Another major concern hanging all over all of this is digital ownership. As gaming becomes increasingly subscription driven and digitally focused, more players are starting to question what they actually own long term. We've already seen situations where digital content disappears, storefronts shut down, licensing agreements expire, or access changes over time. Consumers are becoming more aware that modern gaming ecosystems often prioritize access over ownership. That concern ties directly into subscription growth because subscriptions fundamentally shift the relationship consumers have with media. Instead of purchasing something permanently, players increasingly pay recurring fees for temporary access within ecosystems companies fully control. And honestly, I think that's part of why many players still place tremendous value on premium single player releases. They feel more tangible, more permanent, more complete. Even in a digital environment, a major narrative driven experience often feels like something players truly experienced and owned emotionally in a way many live service games simply don't. There's a beginning, middle, and end. There's artistic identity. There's a memorable journey. Those experiences often stay with players for years. Sony built its reputation on delivering exactly those kinds of games, and returning to that focus may ultimately strengthen the PlayStation brand significantly if the company fully commits to it. At the same time, though, Sony still has to balance profitability expectations with consumer goodwill. Investors want growth. Publishers want recurring revenue. Executives want predictable engagement metrics. Single player games, even massively successful ones, operate very differently from ongoing monetized ecosystems. That tension isn't going away anytime soon. The gaming industry overall is still trying to figure out how to balance premium experiences with long-term monetization strategies without alienating consumers in the process. Some companies have handled that balance better than others. For Sony specifically, the path forward seems more clear than it did a few years ago. PlayStation doesn't necessarily need to become the dominant live service company in gaming to remain successful. What Sony arguably needs most is to continue being the company associated with premium exclusives players genuinely cannot wait to experience. That identity already worked. It already built one of the strongest console brands in the industry. Sometimes the smartest strategy isn't reinventing your identity entirely. Sometimes it's recognizing what made your brand successful to begin with and doubling down on those strengths instead of chasing every trend happening around you. Still, none of this automatically means Sony will avoid criticism moving forward. If PlayStation Plus prices continue increasing while players feel the service isn't evolving enough, frustration will absolutely continue growing. Consumers today are more sensitive to value than they were several years ago. People are evaluating subscriptions more carefully. They're prioritizing where their money goes. And gaming companies are increasingly competing not just against each other, but against subscription fatigue itself. There are only so many recurring payments consumers are willing to tolerate before they start cutting back. Ultimately, Sony returning to narrative-driven single-player exclusives feels like a recognition that PlayStation's greatest strength was never simply technology or subscription ecosystems. It was the emotional connection players formed with the experiences associated with the brand. Those games helped define entire console generations. They gave PlayStation prestige. They gave players confidence. They created unforgettable moments that people still talk about years later. If Sony fully recommits to that identity while avoiding the temptation to over monetize every aspect of the ecosystem, PlayStation could end up in a very strong position moving forward. But if subscription prices continue rising while players feel increasingly squeezed financially, the company may find that goodwill only stretches so far. Modern gamers are passionate, but they're also becoming more cautious consumers. Companies can't endlessly raise prices without eventually facing pushback. Sony's future success may depend on whether players genuinely believe the experiences being offered still justify the growing costs attached to the ecosystem. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want even more in-depth gaming discussions, consider supporting me on Patreon. My latest Patreon exclusive takes a deep dive into how players don't truly own their digital games and why that issue is becoming more important across the gaming industry. Thank you all for watching, and as always, game on.